Welcome, everyone. Today, we're going to make real estate contracts simple. Now, I know when some students hear the word contracts, they start thinking, oh no, legal language, this is going to be confusion. But I promise you, contracts are not as scary once you break them down. By the end of this presentation, you'll understand the basics of contract, listing agreements, purchase contracts, how contracts end, and how this shows up on the real estate exam. Here's our roadmap for today. We're going to start with why contracts matter, then move into contract basics, listing agreements, purchase contracts, contract termination, exam prep, and finally, we'll wrap up with encouragements and next steps. Think of this like building a house. We're going to start with the foundation first, then build everything step by step. All right, so let's start with the big picture. Before we get into definitions and contract types, we need to understand why contracts matter so much in real estate. Because honestly, real estate without contracts would be a mess. Contracts provide protections and clarity for everyone involved. The buyer knows what they're buying, the seller knows what they're selling, the broker knows their role, and everyone knows the deadline, responsibility, and terms. Without a contract, people would be relying on memory and verbal promises, and we all know how that's going to go. So, contracts help keep the transaction organized and legally protected. This is also why contracts are heavily tested on the real estate exam. The exam wants to know if you can recognize important contract terms, understand what makes a contract valid, and identify what happens when something goes wrong. So don't just memorize contract vocabulary. The goal is to understand how these concepts apply in real life situations. Now that we understand why contracts matter, let's move into the basic. This section gives us a foundation. Once you understand the basic contract language, listen agreements and purchase contracts will make much more sense. A contract is legally enforceable agreement between two or more parties. In simple terms, it's a promise that the law can enforce. In real estate, that could be a buyer agreeing to purchase a property, a seller agreeing to sell, or a broker agreeing to market a property. So whenever you hear the word contract, think enforceable agreement. Now let's talk about the different types of contracts. This is where students sometimes get nervous because the term sounds similar. But don't worry, we're going to simplify them. The main contract types you'll want to recognize are bilateral, unilateral, executory, executed, void, and voidable. Now that we know the types of contracts, let's talk about what makes a contract valid. A valid contract generally needs four major elements: offer and acceptance, consideration, capacity, and legal purpose. If one of these important elements is missing, the contract may not be valid or enforceable. Now let's move into listing agreements. This is where the seller and broker officially begins working together. And this is important because a broker usually cannot just wake up one day and decide to market someone's property. There needs to be an agreement. A listing agreement is a contract between a seller and a broker that authorizes the broker to help sell the property. Think of it as the official permission slip. It tells the broker, yes, you are allowed to market this property, look for buyers, and potentially earn compensation. So, listing agreements are very important in both real estate practice and the exam. Now, let's look into the main types of listing agreements. An open listing gives the seller the most flexibility because the seller can work with multiple brokers. An exclusive agency listing gives one broker the right to represent the seller, but the seller can still find their own buyer and avoid paying commission. An exclusive right to sell listing gives the broker the strongest protection because the broker earns commission regardless of who finds a buyer. And a net listing allows the broker to keep anything above the seller's required amount, but this is discouraged because it can create ethical concerns. The most common listing agreement is the exclusive right to sell. This is a major exam point. The broker earns the commission regardless of who finds the buyer. So if you see an exam question asking which listing agreement gives the broker the greatest protection, think exclusive right to sell. Now let's move from the seller and the broker relationship to the buyer and seller relationship. This brings us to the purchase contract. This is where the transaction really starts moving towards closing. A purchase contract establishes the terms and conditions for the sale and purchase of the real estate. Think of it like the roadmap for the transaction. It explains the price, deadline, financing, property details, and what both sides are agreeing to. Without this roadmap, the transaction will be very difficult to manage. Some of the main elements in the purchase contract includes the purchase price, financing term, closing date, and property description. The purchase price tells us how much the buyer is agreeing to pay. The financing section explains how the buyer plans to pay. The closing date tells us when the ownership is scheduled to transfer. And the property description identifies exactly what property is being sold. Every detail matters. Now let's talk about contingencies. A contingency is a condition that must be met for the contract to continue. Common examples include inspection, financing approval, and appraise related conditions. These are important because they protect the buyer if someone does not go as planned. So when you see the word contingency, think condition or protection. Earnest money is the buyer's good faith deposit. It shows the seller that the buyer is serious about moving forward. This money is usually held in escrow and later applied towards the buyer's cost at closing. And because earnest money involves escrow, you already know the exam may test it. Now let's talk about how contracts can legally end. And this is important. Contract termination does not always mean something bad happened. Sometimes a contract ends simply because everyone did what they were supposed to do. There are several ways a contract can terminate. Performance means all parties completed their obligations. Mutual agreement means both parties agree to end the contract. Recession means the contract is canceled and the parties are returned to their original positions. Operation of law means the law ends the contract because of a legal reason such as death or destruction of property. The exam may ask you to identify which type of termination applies in this scenario. A breach of contract happens when one party fails to perform their contractual duties. For example, if one party refuses to do what they agreed to do without a valid reason, that may be a breach. And a breach can lead to legal consequences, damages, or other remedies. So when you see a breach, think someone failed to perform. Specific performance is a legal remedy where the court orders the breaching party to perform as agreed. In real estate, this is important because every property is considered unique. So instead of only awarding money damages, a court may say, no, you need to complete the deal. This is a common contract remedy to remember for the exam. Now let's shift into exam prep mode. At this point, we've covered the major contract concepts. Now the question is, how do you study this information in a way that helps you pass the exam? One common mistake students make is memorizing terms without understanding them. They may know the definition, but when the exam gives them a scenario, they get stuck. So don't just ask, what does this word mean? Ask, how would this show up in a real estate transaction? The most common exam traps usually involve confusing similar terms. Students mix up bilateral and unilateral. They confuse executing and executory. They confuse void and voidable. They also mix up exclusive agency with exclusive right to sell. The best way to avoid this is to compare similar terms side by side. The best way to study contracts is to focus on the basics and practice questions. Practice scenario questions are especially helpful because that's how the exam often tests you. The more examples you see, the easier it becomes to recognize what the question is really asking. On exam day, slow down and read carefully. Contract questions often include small wording changes that completely change the answer. Manage your time. Eliminate obviously wrong answers and don't rush just because the question looks familiar. Sometimes the familiar looking questions are the tricky ones. Now let's bring everything together. We've covered what contracts are, the major types, what makes a contract valid, listing agreements, purchase contracts, contract termination, and exam strategy. That's a lot, but notice how it all connects. I want you to remember this. You can master real estate contracts. You do not need to be a legal expert. You just need to understand the main concept, practice applying them, and stay consistent. So keep studying, Keep practicing, and most importantly, focus on understanding, not just memorizing. Because once you understand contracts, they become much less intimidating. You can master real estate contracts. Thank you for watching, and I hope this helps make real estate contracts feel easier and more approachable. Keep practicing, keep reviewing, and remember, every successful real estate professional had to learn contracts at some point too.